today's plenary session. Our plenary speaker for this morning is a professor of philosophy and director of the Center for Philosophy, Theology, and Cultural Traditions at the St. Francis Xavier University, Antigonish, Nova Scotia. He was formerly professor of philosophy and professor of religious studies at St. Thomas University in Fredericton, New Brunswick, where he also served as vice president for academia. He has taught as a visiting professor at the universities in Asia and Europe, including the Catholic University of Lublin, Korean Catholic University, and Suzhou University in Taiwan. A past president of the Canadian Philosophical Association, he is currently the president of the World Union of Catholic Philosophical Societies and the Intercultural Internationale Jacques Maritain in Rome, the vice president of research for the Council for Research in Values in Philosophy, as well as a member of the steering committee of the Fédération Internationale des Sociétés de Philosophie. He has lectured on 6 continents and has published extensively in philosophy and religious studies, particularly in the history of modern philosophy and religion, the philosophy of religion, and cross-cultural philosophy. He is editor of the journals Philosophy, Culture, and Traditions, and Collingwood and British Idealism Studies. He is also the author or editor of some 30 books. Among the more recent are Religion and Challenges of Science, published in 2007, The Dialogue of Cultural Traditions, published in 2008, Rethinking the Role of Philosophy in the Global Age, published in 2009, The Moral, Social, and Political Philosophy of the British Idealists, published in 2009, Freedom of Religion, published in 2010, and Integrating Texts and Traditions, 2011. He is also the editor of the Biographical Encyclopedia of British Idealism. His translation of Jacques Maritain's posthumously published lectures on natural law will appear in a volume of Maritain's collected works, which he is compiling for the University of Notre Dame Press. My friends, an honor and privilege to be chairing this session of a person whom I consider to be a friend and a mentor. Let's welcome Professor Dr. William Sweet.
I'd like to thank Louis Jim for his very kind introduction, and I'd also like to thank the rector of the university, the chairs of the various committees that were involved in this conference, but also especially my colleague and friend, Dr. Alfredo Coe, who is the convener of this event. I'd like to thank them for all their work and for all their hospitality. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be here, to be invited here, and to share some ideas with you. So on behalf of myself and on behalf of the World Union of Catholic Philosophical Societies, I'd like to thank you all for this. I want to talk today about a theme that has come up in a number of the sessions during this conference, the theme of intercultural or comparative philosophy. And I want to look at it in relation to Catholic philosophical traditions. And I'm going to try to keep my remarks fairly brief so that it will allow an opportunity for people to raise questions and make comments on the presentation. I think that in many quarters today, the contact of civilizations and cultures is said to be far from dialogical. And some have argued that given differences of worldviews, differences of values, and even differences in the concept of reason, that genuine understanding and dialogue are scarcely possible. There is, they claim, a clash of civilizations. Now, the theme of this conference, Thomism and Asian Cultures, celebrating 400 years of dialogue across civilizations, challenges this view. But in doing so, it raises a number of questions, especially concerning the role of Catholic philosophical traditions in contributing to such a dialogue. So this morning what I want to do is I want to pursue some of these questions by examining whether, and if so, how, Catholic philosophical traditions are consistent with the project of an intercultural philosophy. And so to do this, I begin with a brief account of philosophy in the Catholic traditions, as described in the 1998 encyclical of Pope John Paul II, Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason. And I follow this with some reasons why some people may think that such a philosophy, or the kind of philosophy described in that encyclical, may be unsuited to intercultural dialogue, especially in the contemporary era. Now next I present some models of intercultural philosophy and briefly explain how such an intercultural approach to philosophy might contribute to dialogue. What I will suggest, however, is that many of the features of an intercultural philosophy can in fact be found in the philosophies present in the Catholic traditions, and in fact in some of the philosophies identified in the encyclical. So I want to conclude then that intercultural philosophy may be a way of doing philosophy in the Catholic traditions that is especially suited to our contemporary intercultural environment. So first let me say something very briefly about the understanding of philosophy in the encyclical Fides et Ratio. So in his 1998 encyclical, Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason, John Paul II provides a general description of philosophy in the Catholic traditions. The focus of the encyclical, of course, is about truth, but it maintains that among the resources for attaining truth is philosophy. Now, admittedly, philosophy is only one resource. There's also faith, and there are some truths which philosophy cannot know. But the encyclical emphasizes all cultures have philosophy. You see this in section 3. Philosophy, then, would seem to be especially well placed if there is to be a dialogue among cultures. What philosophy is, however, is never concisely stated in that encyclical. According to Fides et Ratio, philosophy is a species of reason, but the encyclical is somewhat vague about what exactly its content is. At the very least, however, I think that we can notice 9 key points about philosophy in that encyclical. First, philosophical truth is something which all people seek. There is, it says in section 16, a desire for knowledge that is characteristic of all people, and there is a human capacity for metaphysical inquiry. Second, the kind of philosophy advocated in the encyclical is truth-seeking and truth-attaining. John Paul affirms the human capacity to know the truth, and he affirms the principle that the human being can arrive at the truth. Thus, reason is not only capable of knowing, but it does know. There is a core of philosophical insight and fundamental moral norms which are shared by all. He says this in section 4. Now this truth that is the key of Fides et Ratio, has a universal and absolute character. He says it can never be confined to time and culture. See this in section 95. Moreover, these philosophical truths can be given within a unified and organic vision of knowledge, and it can form a system, a systematic body of content. Such a philosophy, however, he says, must be realist. It accepts that there is a reality and that there are things which exist independently of human consciousness, perception, and awareness, but which can be known by us. Philosophy, then, it says, cannot be relativist, skeptical, historicist, eclecticist, nihilist, or pragmatist. At least I would say in the senses described. And I think it's important to realize that when these philosophies are challenged, they're challenged for the reasons that are sort of sketched out very briefly in Fides et Ratio. Philosophy then must be of a genuinely metaphysical range, that is capable of transcending empirical data in order to attain something absolute, ultimate, and foundational in its search for truth. He says this in section 83. Seventh, philosophy must have a sapiential dimension. It asserts that there is an ultimate and overarching meaning of life. And then finally, I think, the kind of philosophy advocated in the encyclical is one that has a relation to faith. John Paul II refers, for example, to the Church's duty to indicate elements in a philosophical system which are incompatible with one's own faith. And he holds that philosophers should accept the truth offered by divine revelation. That's in section 75. Now, the encyclical recognizes that no single philosophical system is definitive, but it insists that there must nevertheless be methods of philosophical inquiry which can lead human beings, irrespective of religious commitment, to truth. So as noted above, according to the encyclical, philosophy is important because it provides, in the words of the encyclical, a ground for understanding and dialogue. That is, it provides the possibility of a shared discourse. Indeed, philosophy is necessary for such an exchange. Philosophical and critical thinking, which is concerned with the universal, is required, it says, for a fruitful exchange among cultures. That's as he says in section 69. Specifically, philosophy follows a method in a large sense. That is, it talks about right reason. And through this method, it's capable of arriving at truths, and it allows certain truths to be expressed or to come out. And philosophy can perform these functions across cultures because, broadly speaking, philosophy is autonomous, and its truths can stand independent of culture. And indeed, the encyclical says, these truths and these philosophies form thought and culture. Now, this is, I think, the view that one gets when one reads Fides et Ratio. Now, such a view or model of philosophy has had its critics, both from within and from outside the community of Catholic philosophers. And it's led some people to think that philosophy in the Catholic traditions is unsuited to intercultural dialogue, especially in the contemporary era. So consider some of the principal reasons why someone might think so. In the first place, it's been argued, philosophy is not independent of culture. Philosophies are rooted in cultures. Culture gives philosophers not only the language, but the values, problems, and questions which they pursue. Our culture tells us what counts as philosophy, as distinct from literature, history, and religion. It also tells us what counts as appropriate criteria for meaning, truth, and proof. In short, culture determines how philosophical questions are expressed and answered. In fact, you could say that culture also determines what kinds of questions are raised in the first place. Philosophy in the Catholic traditions, however, would seem to admit none of this. Now, secondly, philosophy described within the encyclical and within the Catholic traditions seems to be one that is deeply rooted in the history of what is called the West. Fides et Ratio, it is claimed, presents a model of philosophy that is not only systematic, but rationalistic. It does not, critics claim, reflect the many approaches to philosophy to be found outside, but also sometimes within the Western traditions. Other traditions which are legitimate ways of expressing the genius of a culture and also ways of engaging other cultures. In fact, critics would say the kind of philosophy advocated in the encyclical simply begs the question as to what philosophy is. Now, third, as the late Richard Rorty, among many others, would point out, there simply is no single subject matter or method which can univocally be called philosophy. This is something that came up in the discussion yesterday. There are various philosophies, but there is no perennial understanding or notion that we can call philosophy. For example, in some traditions, philosophy is sometimes done in the form of commentaries on what we might regard as religious texts. And so they may not look at all like what we think philosophy should be. One also notes radical differences in style and method between Asian or Aboriginal traditions and the European. Indeed, one of the traditional challenges in philosophy is how we can understand philosophical traditions when our own approach is so different from others, when our own approach is so different from the traditions and cultures in which the questions of those cultures were initially articulated. Consequently, these critics would say there is nothing universal that might serve as a ground or a basis for a single philosophical system. Furthermore, the notion of philosophy that seems characteristic of the Catholic traditions supposes that there is a reality to be known and some objective and universal truth to be attained. But critics would say there is no objective reality, or at least there is no objective truth to be known. And in fact, there is a deep suspicion of the powers of reason. Reality is constructed differently by different cultures and traditions, and even if one finds apparent similarities, these constructions are ultimately incommensurable. And there are other criticisms as well. These critics conclude then that philosophy in the Catholic traditions like much of that which we find in the history of Western philosophy, simply assumes what it has no right to assume about philosophy. Thus, it cannot provide the basis for dialogue or propose common access to truth, and neither can it serve as or have a place within an intercultural philosophy. So I think, again, that there are a number of challenges to the type of the model of philosophy that seems to be characteristic of Fides et Ratio, and that seems to be broadly characteristic of the Catholic philosophical traditions. These are, I think, criticisms that are familiar to you all. Now, the preceding criticisms then not only challenge the cross-cultural character of philosophy in the Catholic traditions, but it challenges the possibility of any cross or intercultural philosophy whatsoever. And yet such a conclusion clearly goes too far. We might note, for example, that despite the obvious differences in approaches to philosophy that one finds in different cultures and traditions, and despite the recognition of the relation of philosophies to the cultures in which they arise, philosophical texts and philosophical traditions are not obviously restricted to their culture of origin. Consider, for example, the phenomenon of what I call migrating texts and traditions. It seems to be a plain fact that many philosophical texts and many philosophical traditions have been introduced into cultures and philosophical traditions very different from their cultures of origin. We see this in the introduction of Buddhist philosophy into China, Korea, and Japan, but also into North America and Europe from its original home in India. We see this as well in cases where Western philosophies have been introduced into non-Western cultures and traditions. So where Western philosophies have been introduced into Africa, into the Indian subcontinent, and into China and Japan. And while it seems to be the case that some philosophies have been rather unsuccessful in migrating into other cultures, and I certainly don't mean to say that all philosophies can migrate into different cultures and traditions, some have been unsuccessful. Nevertheless, I think a case can be made for some philosophies to apply across cultures and into different cultures. And thus some have proposed the development of what they call intercultural philosophy. Now what then is intercultural philosophy? And does it provide us with a way of doing philosophy in the Catholic traditions? Now there are many advocates of intercultural philosophy, but I think it's a somewhat vague notion. And so let me just very quickly identify a couple of different ways in which this notion of intercultural philosophy has been understood. One approach is rooted in the phenomenological tradition in Europe, with Paul Masson-Roussel, who lived from 1882 to 1956. He taught at the École Pratique des Études in Paris, and he was a longtime editor of the Revue philosophique de la France et de l'étranger. Masson-Roussel proposed the development of a comparative philosophy. He did this in the early 20th century. And he described the comparative philosophy as being the general examination of the ways in which human beings of all races and cultures reflect upon their actions and act upon their reflections. While Masson-Roussel held that philosophers look at a wide range of content, he did not say that this would lead to any specific content or set of answers. Masson-Roussel's emphasis was on method. He says, and this is my translation, the true problem of comparative philosophy consists not in the determination of the concept, but rather in the pursuit of a rigorous method. Masson-Roussel's approach is certainly valuable, as it proposes to open up our understanding of what philosophy is and how it is done. But it seems to be a largely descriptive enterprise. It's like a bit of a history of ideas. And it doesn't so much provide a philosophical method for identifying, clarifying, and addressing philosophical problems, or for that matter, even addressing philosophical problems that arise across cultures. Now, a different and more recent response has been that of Franz Martin Wiener. Now, here intercultural philosophy is described, quote, as the endeavor to give expression to the many and often marginalized voices in philosophy in their respective cultural contexts, and thereby to generate a shared, fruitful discussion granting equal rights to all. The aim, then, of this type of intercultural philosophy that Wiener is interested in is to facilitate and develop a new and timely culture of a plurality of philosophical dialogues between thinkers from around the world, and he calls this a polyglot. Like Masson-Roussel, then, Wiener wishes to open up philosophy, and to do so by promoting exchange. Yet again, While this approach shows an interest in opening up the philosophizing and the doing of philosophy, it's relatively silent about what exactly is to be discussed and what exactly is to be achieved. That is, what kind of results or answers are going to be productive of this. It's also somewhat silent about how one can be sure that one is getting things right. What is the practice of philosophy? How might, to use his words, claims prove themselves interculturally? And how are cultures and cultures to be consciously kept in view in the context of philosophizing? While this approach is undoubtedly intended not to propose a particular method or content, the openness of this approach does not seem to bring us very far in addressing these issues, or in going beyond consensus and finding answers to problems. Now, these first two understandings of intercultural philosophy are admittedly from what people call the West. A third, and I think somewhat more substantive response, comes from what people might call the East. That is from India, and they can be found in the writings of philosophers like Sarvapati Radhakrishnan, P.T. Raju, but also figures such as Alvin Widgery, as a result of contact between British and Indian philosophers in the early and mid-20th century. Radhakrishnan and Raju not only sought to engage philosophies outside of India and outside of the Hindu traditions, but proposed the development of a comparative philosophy that would involve philosophical traditions from the West, from China, and from India. Here too, though, the objective of comparative philosophy was somewhat vague and ambiguous. Was its aim to simply bring philosophical traditions into contact? Or was it to bring them into dialogue? Was it to compare concepts, or compare arguments, or compare traditions? Or was the comparative activity to be something more substantive? For example, to provide some kind of integrated outlook based on assumptions about a common platform from which philosophical reflection is to begin. Namely, is it to try to identify certain common interests and aspirations of humanity? Now, Radhakrishnan and Raju were aware of these concerns and of these questions, but they didn't seem to address them completely. Moreover, despite the efforts to bring different traditions into the mix, their work to synthesize different traditions or show how they were complementary met with substantial resistance. Resistance a bit in India, but certainly in other countries. Now there is, however, I think, a fourth understanding of intercultural philosophy, although it doesn't describe itself as such. And it's that of the South African philosopher, Rudolf Herneley. Herneley lived from 1880 until 1943. Born in Germany, raised in India and Germany, educated in Britain, and then serving as professor in Durham, in the United Kingdom, at Harvard, at Cape Town, and Johannesburg, Herneley employed what he called the synoptic method. For Herneley, a synoptic philosophy is simply one that seeks to achieve a coherent worldview, or an integration by the individual of the various conflicting or disparate aspects of culture. It, and here's a quotation from one of his works, it rests on the assumption that truth has many sides, and that to the whole truth in any subject, every point of view has some contribution to make. But achieving this coherence requires at least an identity to identify oneself with the life around oneself, to enter into it, and to share it from the inside, rather than to stand outside as a mere spectator, or even to reject it as foreign to oneself. In short, then, the synoptic method is an attitude and an ideal of comprehensiveness and inclusiveness. This effort to enter into a culture or tradition and to attempt to share it from the inside is one that acknowledges the importance of culture and its practices. Yet Hernley's approach was also synoptic and integrative. To understand a thing on his view, you have to see it in relation to other things. It has to be understood in relation to something more comprehensive. Knowledge and truth, then, were the product of a comprehensiveness of vision. Nevertheless, this insistence on integration and unity was not, or at least not necessarily, monistic. Knowledge of other cultures and traditions than one's own was necessary. First, because cultures and traditions were manifestations of human responses to the world. And it said something that was at least in part true about the world. At the same time, the divisions, tensions, and conflicts and the like that one finds in a culture and in the world needed to be brought into some measure of coherence and consistency. This approach held that no culture or tradition was complete, nor could it be, so long as what was known could be more deeply understood, and so long as there was new experience to be encountered and engaged. So philosophy had to be fundamentally open, partly because no finite set of truths or principles can exhaust the infinite, but also because there's always the possibility of novelty. There's always something new that comes along that has to be engaged. Now, such an intercultural philosophy was primarily a method. Hernley was not offering in advance a specific content to philosophy, although he would hold that philosophy, and in fact he would hold that all knowledge, was broadly coherent, and that this coherence was a demand of what he might call rationality, and that the reality that one sought to know had to be ultimately coherent. To know what a thing is to know it in its relation to other things. Now, there are clearly advantages to such a view of philosophy. One advantage is that it provides a recognition of the role of culture in philosophy. It recognizes that philosophy is a part of culture, and that culture clearly influences philosophy. Yet, while recognizing that philosophical texts and traditions are indeed the products of culture, and although they are rooted in culture, it does not take any particular culture or any particular philosophical tradition or school as normative. It's open to engaging all forms of experience. It does not rule out any particular experience a priori, and hence it's open to the spiritual and transcendent, and thereby to metaphysics and to religion. By recognizing the relation of culture and tradition, it is in principle respectful of traditions, for all existing institutions are manifestations of one form of the human spirit. But it does not claim that any existing institution or any existing tradition is a finished and complete story. It's a view that is realist in the sense that it proposes that reality and truth can be uncovered and are accessible to us. But it also acknowledges that reality has been uncovered in many different ways, and that there is not simply one way in which reality can be accessed and explained. Philosophy, then, is truth-seeking, and it sees truth as related to human flourishing. Though philosophy by itself does not have a particular model of human flourishing or of the good. Because reality can be uncovered in different ways, there may be, at least initially, significant disagreement among cultures and traditions, and among philosophers. We can see then that what is already shared may not be the answers, or even a particular method, but a set of questions, perhaps. Questions about what human beings are, about the world in which they live, and their place in that world, as well as about what they ought to do. Now, it's true that such an approach makes certain assumptions about reaching answers, and it also makes certain minimal assumptions about method. Nevertheless, an intercultural philosophy on this model has the potential to cross borders, and it can serve as a tool for investigating and engaging all cultures and philosophies. But it can also serve as a tool in searching for truth, which is not restricted to the local or the contextual. Such an intercultural philosophy, then, I think, is clearly suited to dialogue. Now, is there any conflict of this approach with Catholic philosophical traditions? And I think at first glance one might say that there is. Given its emphasis on understanding cultures from the inside by entering into them, such a model might look to be historicist. It may also seem relativist. Its claim that the truth has many sides, that particular expressions of knowledge and truth are never fully complete, and that new experience will and should oblige us to rethink what we already know, may suggest that the truth cannot be attained, and it may suggest that such an approach itself is rather eclecticist. Nor is there any obvious role in this account of philosophy for an external influence, such as the magisterium, or for truths of faith. Nevertheless, I think there is reason to believe that this kind of intercultural philosophy is broadly consistent with philosophies in the Catholic traditions. In fact, I would say one could find reflections of this in the model of St. Thomas himself. Indeed, the view of philosophy in faith and reason is, I think we should note, nuanced, and it's less categorical than some philosophers might think. So, as I say, I think that when one reads Fides et Ratio, I think it's a much more nuanced document than some critics would say. So here then, let me return to Fides et Ratio and draw your attention to 7 points. First, as we've seen, in the Catholic traditions, the human being, the human person is fundamentally a being who questions. There are fundamental questions which pervade human life across cultures, and there is a desire to know the truth. There is then a desire for knowledge, a knowledge which is intercultural and transcultural, and which at least aspires to be a unified and organic state. While philosophical questioning is characteristic of human nature, it is profoundly determined by culture. In section 103, Fides et Ratio says, philosophy is the mirror which reflects the culture of a people. Fides et Ratio holds that there is, or at least there can be, truth. But truth is necessarily expressed in and through history and culture, and not infrequently it's expressed in an imperfect form. Moreover, truth can be found in different cultures. This is something that you can see as discerned by means of enculturation, and Fides et Ratio refers to this notion of enculturation in section 72. Truth does have a historical character in the sense that it is immersed in time and history. It says that in section 11. And the formulations are bound by time and culture. Indeed, it says in section 51, no historical form of philosophy can legitimately claim to embrace the totality of truth. And while it's true that truth has been attained, it says, yet every truth attained is but a step towards that fullness of truth, and the search for truth is never ending. To understand the philosophy of another culture or tradition, the encyclical recognizes that one must, as it were, enter into it. There is, however, no specific way of doing this. Faith and Reason, Fides et Ratio, notes that there are different approaches and methods. It says that every people has its own native and seminal wisdom. Fides et Ratio also warns us of philosophical pride, that by which a tradition is tempted to identify one single stream with the whole of philosophy, and which seeks to present its own partial and imperfect view as the complete reading of all of reality. It says this in section 4. The encyclical reiterates, the Church has no philosophy of her own, nor does she canonize any one particular philosophy in preference to others. And other approaches, such as those of John Henry Newman, Antonio Rosmini, Jacques Maritain, Etienne Gilson, and Edith Stein, and in an Eastern context, Vladimir Soloviev, Pavel Florensky, Vladimir Delsky, and so on, are also valuable. This is detailed in section 59. Philosophy must be humble in its claims. Human reason has fragility and limitations. It says this in section 43. Fragility and limitations derive from the disobedience of sin. The meaning of concepts, it says, is often imperfect. Moreover, while what philosophy knows in metaphysics can be true and certain, it is also imperfect and analogical. Nor should a philosophy claim that it is complete. In the Catholic traditions, while there is a tendency towards the fullness of divine truth, our habitual patterns of thought are in no way capable of expressing that wisdom in its fullness. Indeed, Fides et Ratio says there must be an openness. In fact, there is an openness already. It says in section 71, cultures are fed by the communication of values and remain open. They offer different paths to the truth. The encyclical speaks of the extension of the two restricted terms in which their thinking has been framed, and it adds that even in false theories, some truth has been found at times. In short, if we take account of what Fides et Ratio has to say in describing philosophies, or philosophies consistent with the Catholic traditions, we see a number of traits of the modern intercultural philosophy that I described. Philosophy is influenced by culture, and for one to understand a philosophy, one must enter into the history and culture in which it is expressed. Nevertheless, an intercultural philosophy can be realist, truth-seeking, and truth-attaining. While recognizing the role of history, culture, and context in the expression and understanding of philosophical claims, it holds that there are truths. Behind its particular formulations and expressions, there can be truths which are not restricted to their culture of origin. Moreover, it's important to recognize that many philosophical truths have not been fully expressed. Indeed, some which perhaps have been adequately expressed in the past may need to be re-expressed today. Language has changed, culture has changed. And so the same truth may require a different expression while being the same truth. Further, while an intercultural philosophy may be cautious in its statements about what truth has been attained, and about what exactly has been proven, it does so because it recognizes not only that experience is open-ended, but that experience must be so if it's to allow for the possibility of an infinite. An openness towards cultures and traditions suggests that an intercultural philosophy will be open as well to the assertions of faith, with the proviso, as with any philosophy which must by definition have an autonomous character, with the proviso that such religious assertions can only serve as indications to the philosopher. Finally, while an intercultural philosophy does not focus specifically on the question of the meaning of life, one would naturally be led to include a statement of humanity's place in it. In short, not only is there no reason why we should think that an intercultural philosophy cannot be and cannot transmit Catholic philosophical traditions, with its insistence on truth, for example, but those traditions which have been most successful in engaging other philosophies and cultures have arguably had the characteristics that I've just mentioned, the 7 characteristics. So in conclusion, let me say that it seems to me that Catholic philosophical traditions have generally not been expressed in terms of an intercultural philosophy, but as constituting specific systems. And while at times Peter Ratio itself does this, and while at times it frequently adverts to the model of Thomas Aquinas, it's instructive to note that the encyclical is careful to say that it is not the particular claims of Thomas, but his example that is to be imitated, that his activity and his vision is a model, and it's especially a model for theological studies. Even though an intercultural philosophy may possess features that are not obviously characteristic of some of the past models of philosophy in the Catholic traditions, it is at least in many respects to just such a model that Catholic philosophies, I think, can aspire. First, the fact that our philosophical questions are, at least in some measure, a product of or a response to cultures, and the fact that our cultures are increasingly pluralistic remind us that philosophers need to engage and to respond to that diversity. And in doing so, it makes us especially aware of the strength and of the limits of philosophy. As Marcel writes, the person schooled in intercultural philosophy recognizes the factors which produce and transform reason, as well also as those which subvert reason. Second, the study of philosophies from different traditions may offer us a number of opportunities and challenges. In some areas, such as aesthetics, the contact with other traditions may be especially inviting and stimulating. In other areas, such as political philosophy, dealing with differences of culture and tradition may be more challenging, although we may be still prepared to go some way into the resources of those traditions in order to examine the issues more thoroughly. And of course, there are areas that would likely have us call into question how we approach matters entirely, as in the philosophy of religion. When we encounter a religion without God, which is arguably the case in Buddhism, a number of the classical problems of the philosophy of religion would seem to be altogether irrelevant. And so the way in which we engage in an intercultural philosophy of religion would be very different from what we are used to. Third, in pursuing an intercultural philosophy that leads us to investigating other cultures and traditions, this may force us also to rethink and represent our own philosophies. It would certainly force us to be more aware of our assumptions and, as in most cases where we are presented with new information, we may be forced to reevaluate our own views and to consider alternatives. But to ignore other traditions would certainly be very difficult to justify. An intercultural philosophy, in the sense that I've described it here, is not only consistent with Catholic philosophical traditions, but has arguably already been a way of doing philosophy in the Catholic traditions, a way that is suited to our intercultural environment. It's a way in which St. Thomas himself brought Christianity and pagan thought, Platonism and Aristotelianism, Augustine and Pseudo-Dionysius, Averroes and Avicenna into contact. It's a way present arguably in the philosophical work of Matteo Ricci, Julius Aleni, and the other missionaries to China in the 16th and 18th centuries, who sought to introduce Aristotle and later the philosophical traditions of Catholicism into an Asian context. And it may indeed also be, though I don't know of it, the work of the early Dominicans in Asia as well. But it may also be an approach, I think, that is especially suited to philosophical dialogue among different cultures and religions today. And so I think that the model that's provided in Fides et Ratio is not that of a closed system, but one of an open system that invites us to not only do philosophy, but to do philosophy following an intercultural model. Thank you.
So we are within our allotted time. Before we proceed to the open forum, some reminders to the audience. Please state your name and institutional affiliation and country of origin. May we also remind you that you are allowed to ask only one question. Rejoinders and replies are discouraged. And please go direct to the point.
Dr. Professor William, my appreciation for the wonderful presentation. My question is all about the relationship of faith and reason, most especially started by scholasticism during the time of Al-Farabi, Al-Ashari, Maimonides, Averroes. Scholasticism was defined as the rational justification of faith, which takes into account Plato, Aristotle, Neoplatonism. But during the time of Albert the Great and St. Thomas Aquinas, it became a highly evolved system wherein it became a method for the penetration of truth. I remember Heidegger himself criticizing the relationship of faith and reason because of the term Christian philosophy. That philosophy should never be called Christian because everything has already been provided for by the faith. In other words, it takes away the metaphysical anxiety of questioning the deepest reality in our life. In other words, we have to go back to the question of Heidegger, saying, why is there being rather than nothing? But if you look into the continuity effect of tradition, as using the words of Gadamer, historically affected consciousness, if it not had been for the faith, the Dominicans should have not brought Thomism here in the Philippines. In other words, we should not be discussing philosophy now. The question is, could faith still assert its role in spreading out philosophy or the tradition of philosophy? Thank you.
As I say, I'm not sure I caught everything you said, but let me try to just briefly respond to a couple of things that we did raise. I think this issue of Christian philosophy is an interesting issue. It was a much debated issue in the early 20th century. There was a big debate about that. And Jacques Maritain took one view that there could be a Christian philosophy. Other people took it to be, well, it's not really a Christian philosophy because I would suggest that somehow religion had established a presuppositions for philosophy. Some people simply took it as being of talking about philosophy in the Middle Ages and so on, so that kind of tradition. I think that Fides et Ratio is fairly clear that Christian belief, that is, items that are revealed, cannot form axioms or foundations in any philosophical system. But they can provide you with hints, with guidelines, with suggestions that you may take back in dealing with your philosophical work. Now, whether you want to call that approach a Christian philosophy or not, I don't know. I mean, I think I feel quite comfortable in saying that Christian faith can provide a context and provide suggestions in doing philosophy. But at the end of the day, I think that you can talk about philosophical truths as not being essentially tied to matters of Christianity, matters of faith. And that's important for using philosophy or philosophies as a way of dealing with dialogue across cultures. Certainly every philosophy will be informed by the culture that it comes from. But I think that Fides et Ratio says very clearly, and I think this is true, that these truths are not restricted to those cultures and traditions. And so even if we want to talk about Christian philosophy in some sense, a sense that I think is perfectly acceptable, it doesn't prevent it from engaging other cultures and traditions and engaging them in a fruitful way. So I think even the question of faith and reason, I think that's an interesting question. that probably doesn't arise in the same way in different cultures and environments. I think even the notion of faith itself is sometimes rather vague and ambiguous. Whether faith is a series of propositions, whether faith is a disposition, whether faith is a worldview. And so again, I think when we talk about the relation of faith and reason, we have to be very, very clear about, well, what are we talking about when we're talking about faith? What exactly are we talking about when we talk about reason in that way? And this is something, of course, that no encyclical can fully exhaust in providing a description. So I think this question about Christian philosophy and about the relation of faith and reason, I think that there's a lot of openness in the tradition, and it's something maybe that someone like Heidegger was afraid of, because he would have had a background in a more traditional type of scholastic education, and so you could sort of understand the resistance to that. But I don't think that we have to have that same suspicion today. I think that we live in an age that's maybe not only post-scholastic, it's post-Heideggerian, so I don't think we have to really worry about that today. I hope that addresses at least some of the issues that you were concerned about.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Sir? Yes.
Studied at Catholic University. Thanks, Will, for the paper. I found myself mostly in agreement with what you were saying. The one little trouble that I had was really with the whole notion of intercultural philosophy. And my trouble was this. One of the things that you do say, and I think I would, and I certainly agree with this, that in order to understand philosophy from a particular cultural point of view, one needs to enter into that particular culture. And essentially that doesn't require the concept of intercultural philosophy, because presumably my understanding of intercultural philosophy might be very much different to your understanding of intercultural philosophy, and so I need to enter into your understanding of intercultural philosophy in order to understand what you're on about when we're talking about intercultural philosophy. So it seems to me we end up with an infinite regress of intercultural philosophies. So my question here is, do we really need a concept of intercultural philosophy, or can we do without that and perhaps have an understanding that one of the key things about philosophy itself is that it needs to be open to the truth, and if it's not, then we need to ask ourselves whether we're actually committed to an ideology rather than to a pursuit of truth. So my challenge to you, I guess, is, do we really need that particular term, or can we get rid of it?
Maybe it's something about which I have a little bit of ambiguity. I guess I would say this, something anecdotal. When I was an undergraduate student, philosophy began in Greece and it ended in pretty much England. That was about it. And we knew that there were countries sort of, to the east of Greece, and we knew that there were countries to the south of Greece, and we could see them on the map. But we never really heard anything about those countries. And so when I took my courses in modern philosophy consisted of philosophers from Germany, from France, a couple from Holland, and from England. And the empiricists had a good sense to speak in English, that was good. And the continental rationalists, well, they spoke in German or French, which was not really understood, so, there was that view too. What was interesting was that one never heard about Asian or African philosophies, one never heard about that. And part of the argument was, well, it wasn't really philosophy. It was something else. And even for that matter, what was going on in Spain or Italy or Eastern Europe, again, these wasn't really part of the philosophical discussion. I mean, I suppose scholars would have known that there were philosophies out there in these places, but they weren't really contributing to philosophy in a substantial way. It was just sort of the English, the Germans, the French, a few Dutch maybe if you're lucky, and that was about it. Well, if that's what philosophy is, then that's not the philosophy I'm interested in, okay? Because it is leaving out all of these other swamps. So I think that one of the reasons for talking about intercultural philosophy is to say that, well, one has to go to the margins, to, let's call it, forgotten philosophers, or philosophers who are on the margins of that core, of that center. And that's why I want to talk about intercultural philosophy. Now, the way in which they do philosophy, I think, is different. Maybe not as different as we may think. Sometimes I think in reading Indian texts that if we were to compare reading commentaries on the Indian sacred texts with medieval commentaries on religious texts, you'd find a certain sort of resonance. I think you might find that. But I use it in intercultural philosophy because I want to break us out of the sense in which there is the philosophy that is the philosophy that I described, and that the things on the margins are not marginal to philosophy. And so again, to say that, well, I'll look at Aboriginal philosophy, I'll look at Asian philosophy, it's not that it's, I'm being really generous and going beyond where the core of philosophy is. It's that there's something that, that puts them on, ideally, more of an equal playing field. So when I talk about intercultural philosophy, do we need it? Well, we need it, I think, substantively. Do we need the term intercultural philosophy? I think I would use it as a way of trying to break out of that model, which I think still exists. But I wouldn't say that we have to worry about that indefinitely. Ideally, if we break out of it. The issue with infinite regress, I don't think there are an infinite number of intercultural philosophies, but I think there may be a large number of different philosophies. And so, although I think going to other cultures, you want to maybe expand or rethink about how you understand philosophy, I don't think that you end up in an infinite regress of intercultural philosophy. But that's how I would take it. But thank you.
Okay. Then, okay. Down to the last two questions.
I'm Dr. Aguilan from Silingan University. The relationship between faith and reason is always, complex and dynamic. You have a history of conflict between faith and reason. And there was also a time that faith and philosophy can be harmonized. And I think in the Catholic tradition, especially Thomas Aquinas, has viewed that faith and reason could be in harmony. And philosophy, therefore, served as a tool, meaning philosophy in the service of theology or in the service of faith. My question now is intercultural philosophy, which you are proposing in the light of what in the encyclical, the intercultural philosophy, are you proposing that it serve as a method, as a means to bridge, to prepare? It's a way of preparing so that people of other culture, people of other faith, will be receptive to the proclamation of the gospel. And that's problematic in interreligious dialogue. That's always an issue in interreligious dialogue, meaning, are we using philosophy, because that's my understanding in the Catholic tradition, philosophy as the handmaiden of theology, meaning in the service of evangelization, in the service of preparing people of other culture to be receptive to the gospel. Thank you.
Questions that you raised there, but I want to say something about it. Certainly in the Catholic traditions, the idea, the dominant idea, it's not there are other ideas too, but I would say the dominant theme has been that somehow philosophy and faith are in harmony. I won't say can be harmonized, but they are in harmony. Although notice that what Thomas himself would say is that of course, although people's faith and philosophy both are interested in truth, although there can be no contradiction between them, philosophy cannot exhaust what the faith tells you. And so there are things that are true, that Christians know to be true, which are not accessible to philosophical regions, philosophical approaches. So although there's a harmony there, it's not a harmony in the sense that what you find in one, you find in the other. The Catholic traditions are very clear on this, and St. Thomas is very clear on this. The truths of faith will go far beyond things that are known through reason. Reason won't contradict it, reason may help to confirm it without proving it, but I just got to bring that in. So anyway, so I guess the short version of that is that I think that there is that tradition within Christianity within Catholic philosophical traditions, but we shouldn't exaggerate that either. I wouldn't want to exaggerate the harmoniousness of that. Philosophy is a tool in the service of faith. Certainly I agree that has been the case for, again, a large part of the history of Christianity. But philosophy is not just a tool for theology. It's not just that, we're the janitors or something like that, we're going to help theologians clear up problems. I don't think that's what philosophy is. But certainly I hope it does help theologians. In fact, having also studied theology, I wish sometimes theologians would pay more attention to philosophy. About the issue of intercultural philosophy or as a method to bridge, I think it is. And I'll give you the example. I was talking to a priest in Taiwan just very recently, and I asked how one could do theology in that Asian context. And one thing he had to say is that you can't just go at it by starting off with Christian doctrine and dogma, because even though people may be Christians themselves by tradition, by religious tradition, they're not necessarily Christians by culture. And so in order to talk about Christian theology, you have to introduce people to the history and culture of the context in which those theological doctrines arose, in order to make them more aware of what they mean. And so I would say that intercultural philosophy does provide that kind of bridge, where it invites people to enter into other philosophical traditions and cultures, to try to find at least common questions, if not common or answers about which we can talk further about, and that type of dynamic relation, once you enter into that environment, once you understand a bit of that culture and they understand a bit of yours, then dialogue is possible. And I'm sure this is something that the scholars in the audience who deal with Asian philosophies are familiar with. You can't just say, well, I'll read an Asian text, I now know what that tradition is, and now I can talk about it. I mean, that would be absurd. Any more than someone could say, well, I'm going to read Kant, and now I understand Western philosophy. I mean, that would be absurd. You have to enter into that. And so I think that intercultural philosophy may share some of the things that you allude to in talking about interreligious dialogue. But to do that, to understand the other is not just simply to understand, so to speak, the propositions, but to also have a sense of the worldview and the ways of thinking about problems. And I think that can be done, but it's an extremely difficult task. And I'm not saying intercultural philosophy is something that can be easily engaged in, but I am saying that if we do it, it's going to allow us to bridge traditions in a way in which some traditions have not been especially successful.
I'm Ernesto Padilla. Again, because I cannot advertise here, I might as well just say that I'm from Plato's Republic again. I was raised at a time when I was exposed to the culture of Star Trek, where we were raised in a culture of intergalactic encounters. Now, I think that the point here of emphasizing dialogue is the problematic existence of exclusivist faiths in our time, fundamentalism and so on and so forth. Now, sometimes I think if you want an exclusivist faith to open up, sometimes it's pointless to engage in dialogue with them. Would it be a better strategy at times for philosophers to engage in more dialogue, let's say, with other sectors of culture, like scientists or movie producers, TV producers, and also for philosophers to engage in dialogues with themselves, so that they can make the esoteric language more accessible to the masses. So there will come a point in time when exclusivist faiths will, realize that, they are not getting the point. They're already alone because philosophers have alliances with so many others, so they will join the wagon of open-minded beings. Thank you, Doctor.
I don't know what part of the Republic you come from. Anyway, I'll top part, right? So, right, great. I think you raise an interesting question, and a couple of, and I'll try to keep it brief. But it's funny that you mentioned Star Trek. Now, I used to mention Star Trek in my classes to my students because I thought that there is a connection, across from me to them. And now for most of my students, Star Trek, well, they sort of remember maybe the third generation of it, if that, and they only remember it because like their parents or their older brothers and sisters know about it. So that does draw attention, I think, to the point, and that is that the intercultural discussion is not just across, Asian, West, or whatever. It can be within one's own tradition. And I think that one of the challenges of being a professor of philosophy or a professor of anything is trying to find the ways to make those cultural bridges within one's culture. Not just necessarily to philosophy and science or philosophy of science and ethics or things like that. To sort of rethink about the best way of expressing their ideas to overcome those sorts of barriers that we find. So it's not just a barrier between philosophers and scientists or scientists and people in ethics. It can be even within one's own discipline. And so again, not just across those larger cultures. I think, how is that possible? It's a challenge, and maybe at times it's a bit distasteful. And I say this because I'm so convinced that Star Trek is good, and they're so convinced that it's lame, how do I have to sometimes be, and this is a word that comes from Ratio. Philosophers have to be humble. It's not the word that you usually associate with philosophy, but I think it's very important, and that is you have to ask yourself, if you really want to communicate, you have to find ways of making that communication possible. And sometimes there are dead ends. Conversations are going very far, and I think the model of St. Thomas is very good in this, well then you find another point. If this conversation isn't going ahead, let's move to something else and maybe use that. And that is, it's by those sorts of activities, I think, that we can get a real dialogue. So whether you want to call it intercultural or not, I do for, let's call it, pedagogical reasons. I'm not wed to an essentialist view of this. But I think that the reason for the lack of success of some traditions is that it tends to have a very limited view of what philosophy is, and I think it has to have an openness to it. But thank you, and I'd like to come and visit you in the Republic someday.
All right, so that concludes our plenary session for today. We thank our speaker for that enlightening, insightful lecture and discussion, and we also thank our participants for the thought-provoking questions. So once again, a generous applause to our speaker.